Okay, cool. Well, we are at 4 o'clock, so I'll start to introduce our speaker. My name is Paul Gilbert. I'm a reader in the School of Global Studies here at the University of Sussex. And so welcome all to this Sussex Development Lecture, the last of the series for 24-25. The Sussex Development Lectures are run by the Institute of Development Studies in partnership with the School of Global Studies, the Science Policy Research Unit, and the Centre for International Education here at the University of Sussex. Just a brief overview of the format. We'll hear from Sonjah for about 40 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So please put any questions you'd like to ask in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There is also a closed captions facility on Zoom, and just to let you know, this is being recorded and also streamed on YouTube. So we're particularly delighted today to welcome Sonjah Stanley Niaah, Professor of Cultural Studies at the University of West Indies, which signed a Memorandum of Understanding with IDS last year, and also with Sussex for reparations-focused research earlier this year. Sonjah Stanley Niaah is a Jamaican scholar, international speaker, and professor at the University of the West Indies, where she was previously director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Reggae Studies Unit. She is the first PhD in Cultural Studies to graduate from the University of West Indies, and the first to be appointed lecturer and then senior lecturer in Cultural Studies there. Prof. Stanley Niaah was also the inaugural Rhodes Trust Rex Nettleford Fellow in Cultural Studies in 2005, and has distinguished herself as a pioneer in the terrain of Caribbean cultural studies. She's a leading author, teacher, and researcher on Black Atlantic performance geographies, popular culture, and the sacred, and maintains a number of international appointments, including as a member of the Scientific Committee for UNESCO's Roots of Enslaved Peoples Resistance, Liberty and Heritage project. And Prof. Stanley Niaah is, of course, also the director of the Centre for Reparation Research at UWI since last August. And this centre is the arm of the university that supports the research agenda for reparation in the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So as such, we're very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Sonjah Stanley Niaah on the Caribbean reparation movement and the politics of responsibility, mapping new pathways. So I will hand over to you now, Sonjah.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. I want to just thank the organizers, thank the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex, the team I've been communicating with via email over these past few weeks. And I really am inviting all in this moment to come on a journey with me. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that we will have great connectivity for the entire time. Let me say I am at this time traveling, and hopefully it will all be great. So let me, I don't know if let me see if this works well if I go to slideshow. But I think everyone can see my screen, right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Fabulous. Okay, so the CARICOM reparation movement and the politics of responsibility. I wish, first of all, to acknowledge that as I represent the University of the West Indies Mona campus, where I have studied and worked in post-colonial Jamaica, I recognize and declare the land on which we operate as an institution of higher learning is the original or traditional territory of many peoples. The UWI acknowledges the First Nation comprising the indigenous people who were displaced by the Columbus Project and general European colonization, and the hundreds of Africans who toiled for more than 100 years as enslaved people on the old Papine sugar estate. The UWI recognizes their labor and sacrifices in preserving this land that has enabled the establishment of a university that now provides opportunities for many of their descendants to receive an education that they themselves were denied. I speak today from a personal and professional perspective, and the personal is, of course, political. Though this presentation might be triggering, and I apologize for this, I hope you will come with me on this journey into some of my own thoughts. So, what are some of the early beginnings that I wish to engage? How do I come as a scholar to reparatory justice, a dancehall scholar focused on Jamaican popular culture, its global consumption, Black Atlantic performance geographies, etc.? Many of you would know my work from the popular cultural space in which I've worked. I remained aware that the Caribbean's role in the establishment and sustenance of Pan-Africanist ideology is unquestionable. And I'll just move my slide here to the next screen. Pan-Africanist ideology, we all know, fomenting around Ethiopianism, later crystallized in the Rastafari movement, the work and grassroots organizing by such activists as Henry Sylvester Williams, Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, and the UNIA, and institutionalized through conferences, congresses, indeed, events commemorating that 1900 London conference is on now, which Henry Sylvester Williams organized. Of course, Pan-Africanism was consolidated by the 1960s through, among others, political, cultural, spiritual, and artistic expression. And I want to stay with the cultural for a moment. It is, after all, my own disciplinary home. It is important to highlight that the arts, paintings, literary works, musical genres, such as Jamaican reggae, have been central with expressions of Pan-Africanist thought. African diaspora and artist messengers use reggae, for example, as a means to call out downpressors or oppressors, organize, centralize, argue for reparation, and of course, insist on repatriation to the promised land, often represented as Ethiopia. But before I go into this a conversation about the capitalist imperialist impulse, I want to take us through some of my own thinking in relation to Black self-making and what this would have come from in terms of an entire conversation about, a delusion identified by none other than Frederick Hickling. Black self-making, while it is not very much used in literature, has a place, certainly if we go back to Martin Luther King's use of somebodyness, smadification from Rex Nettleford, smaditizing from Charles Mills. These are intricately linked to an analysis of zones of Black creativity. This is how we can speak of the ways in which certainly Blacks who were disenfranchised in an enslavement industry were having to fashion themselves, and into this new era, the same kind of self-fashioning. But is there space for psychohistoriography in a conversation about reparatory justice? Surely. Psychohistoriography, I'm calling here as a method which takes us into the epistemological challenge identified by Hickling. He asserted an alternative hypothesis of social defiance. He asserted that European civilization of the past 5 centuries had been driven by a collective psychosis formulated on the white supremacist delusional attempt of Europeans to own the world and to subjugate people of color to the service of white races. And I wanted to just highlight for you that this was identified as a mental health challenge, and that the mental health challenge for African people around the world at this time is certainly to not recognize the psychosis identified in claiming this kind of ownership of the world. You know, Hickling's principal finding was the recognition that Eurocentric concepts of white supremacy identified European ownership of the world and the people and resources therein by divine right were elements of a collective delusion that has attempted to enslave the world since the 15th century. So psychohistoriography, for me, becomes a method of repair, and one which allows us to consider what Hickling talks about as a sort of modern day madness. And of course, this has implications for the work of Frantz Fanon and others in terms of the representations of memory and mental health. Mental health remains a challenge. There are, in fact, critical psychological and ethnopsychiatry concerns. And this is not the focus of my presentation, but I wanted us to engage with this kind of understanding prior to an engagement with what reparatory justice really means in a time like this. Fanon's original studies, of course, we know from the wretched books like The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skins, White Masks, they are all indeed very much implicated in the kind of work we need to do in the reparatory justice movement. Of course, the case of political reparation must consider the need for physical reparation. So when I talk about reparatory justice, I'm talking about repair at all levels of the entire human experience. Of course, scholars such as Beckles highlight clearly the case for economic reparation, that Britain exited on the cheap, and when countries were given independence, that the federation, which was being articulated inside the nationalist movement in the Caribbean, was one without funding, and that a colonial mess had been left by Britain. So where do I get into a conversation about reparatory justice and the CARICOM reparation movement in particular? There is, of course, an urgency if we consider the Caribbean in terms of intersectionality, that where humans are concerned, race, class, color, age, gender, all of those things then become added dimensions on top of the kind of disenfranchisement we see. But I'm going back to my text to get us into these early beginnings. So the capitalist imperialist impulse that led Europe to the West Indies precipitated a series of dislocations and destructions. Morgan makes the point that there are profound acts of unsilencing of the unspeakable from the violence, internal and external. And I quote, "The trauma of the Middle Passage," she says, "was hitherto relegated to the subterranean realms of the supernatural, myth and metonym." Here, end of quote, she is referencing the shadows that manifest in shame at the inability to leave the past in the past. This is what David Cameron, in the now famous 2015 visit to Jamaica, said with gross insensitivity, that Jamaica, and by extension countries of the region with a history of chattel slavery, should move on from this painful legacy and continue to build. In her quest, Morgan tried to add both personally and politically to the cry for reparatory justice. She surveyed a band of Caribbean writers: Erna Brodber, Earl Lovelace, Jean Rees, George Lamming, Olive Sr., Opal Palmer Adisa, Naipaul, Walcott, Norbasi Philip, John Hearn, a number of them, Michelle Cliff, among others. They have kept us on a journey of remembering, alongside musicians, songwriters, playwrights, and liberation thinkers. Reparation is about righting the wrongs of the past. In fact, it is Beckles who classifies the reparation movement as the greatest political tide of the 21st century. The CARICOM reparation movement begins firmly in the unwavering belief that the genocidal actions against indigenous peoples, as well as the capture, transport, and enslavement of Africans as chattel, was unjust and constitutes a crime against humanity. It begins with the resistance, both outright and unseen, by the indigenous peoples and the enslaved and supported by abolitionists. The movement would steadily grow as the roots of the hatred and discrimination that was foundational in establishing chattel slavery made themselves known in the legislation and social interactions following emancipation and then in independence. When academics joined the fold in the 20th century, the truth was revealed in texts by Eric Williams, Elsa Govaya, Walter Rodney, and many more, showcasing the enormity of the system that sought and indeed still seeks to oppress the global South and placing the responsibility of chattel enslavement squarely at the colonizers' feet. Evidence identified from their own archives revealed them to be criminals, and yet the arguments by Europeans seek to place blame on everyone but themselves, including the victims in this ordeal. The advocates and supporters of reparation have held firm to the evidence, analyzing data and reporting findings that substantiate the claim for reparatory justice. Of course, we are aware the Bratler Report, Quantification for Chattel Slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean, identifies a multitude of harms during and after the period of enslavement, and it provides substantial evidence for the financial demands for reparation. Still, the opposition levied arguments of begging against the movement, labeling former colonies the architects of their own downfall when these colonizers impoverished economies and destroyed resources to build their own societies. Therein lies the politics of responsibility. The acknowledgement that the underlying causes of conflict can be found in the actions of their colonizing ancestors means that an acceptance that there must be retribution and compensation doled out. Certainly the last decade, the Caribbean reparatory justice movement has gained unprecedented momentum, drawing support from governments, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, educational institutions, families, and activists. Following the mandate by CARICOM heads in 2013, the CARICOM Reparations Commission was established. Building upon centuries-old struggle for emancipation and decolonization, this movement has become institutionalized within the University of the West Indies, and CARICOM, with key organizations such as the Caribbean Center for Reparation Research, established in 2017, what you would know as the Center for Reparation Research, serving as a research arm of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Of course, there is a network that includes the national reparation committees. These institutions form the backbone of regional representation and have significantly influenced global discourse on reparatory justice. Over the last 2 decades, reparations movements have gained traction in the USA, the UK, and Africa. Advocacy efforts within the CARICOM Reparations Commission and, of course, the National Reparations Committee networks have strengthened ties across the Caribbean and the African diaspora. The movement has transcended academia and conferences, reaching broader audiences through radio programs, documentaries, newspaper articles, and stakeholder forums have been very visible. But let me use the case of the USA, for example. And I'm just going to go back to my slide where you can see what is going on in the United States, of course, inspired by the Caribbean. California became the first state in the nation to come up with a plan to address reparations for slavery and the lingering effects of anti-Black racism in the United States. The state made history in 2020 with the creation of the nation's first state-level task force to study and develop reparations for the descendants of enslaved African Americans. The state made history again in 2023 with that task force releasing its monumental report outlining California's anti-Black policies that extended beyond slavery and the more than 100 recommendations for making the community whole. There's also the ABC 7 Originals documentary, California's Case for Reparations, and that is viewable on demand. The task force includes colleague academics, radical activist academics, I would say, Dr. Javon Scott Lewis, among others, and of course, the National African American Reparations Commission. They have their own preliminary 10-point reparations program and is a document for review, revision, and adoption as a platform to guide the struggle for reparations for people of African descent in the United States. So what you have on your screen, even though it's a document for review and revision, is entirely, I would say, certainly inspired by the CARICOM's own movement and 10-point plan. And I'll show you now what the CARICOM 10-point plan, I'm sure many of you already know this, but CARICOM's 10-point plan, very similar: formal apology, repatriation, public health crisis, knowledge programs, technology transfer, debt cancellation, many of the very educational programs, cultural institutions, indigenous peoples, all of those being focal areas. Of course, there's a trajectory of the movement, and those can be seen in the ways in which we have established institutions, done research, organized and distributed publications, and so on. And this may be too small a text for you to read, but certainly I have been talking around many of these moments on this timeline or trajectory of reparatory justice, which I would want to highlight. Of course, we now in 2025 are marking the second International Decade for People of African Descent. This decade calls for reparatory justice, equality, and an end to systemic racism, very much coalescing around movements from the start of the last century. Now, if we think about this trajectory, the modern organized reparation movement did not emerge in isolation. And I've gone through some of the creative, political, and other kinds of inputs. Influential figures from Marcus Garvey, Camel Brathwaite, Nettleford Broadbent, many others, Hilary Beckles, Barry Evans, Shepard, have long championed this cause. Before them, of course, abolitionists and freedom fighters such as Bossa, Chief Tachi, Nanny of the Maroons, and countless others laid that firm foundation. Their advocacy, writings, speeches, and creative works provide a crucial platform for advancing reparatory justice by eliminating systemic racism and colonial oppression. The movement, of course, must continue to evolve, incorporating contemporary justice networks, more importantly, including environmental justice, racial equality, and sustainable development. Alongside the progress of the movement, though, there has been a concerted effort to discredit the very intentions of activists. The reality of any successful movement is that it must account for opposition, and the reparation movement has received quite a bit of pushback. The former colonial governments have used a variety of arguments to distance or deflect responsibility for chattel enslavement in the Caribbean region. Their leaders have issued worthless apologies, statements of regret, or the ultimate insult I mentioned earlier: get over it. European efforts to extract themselves from responsibility to the region only enforces their "it wasn't me" syndrome. However, the most damaging opposition comes from within the ranks of our own people. And this is why when we talk about reparatory justice, when we talk about repair, we're also talking about internal repair. This is what I'm referring to as the disparaging actions by reparation. The internal loss, I would say. The most damaging opposition comes from within the ranks of our own people, one that disparages the actions by reparation advocates and adds fuel to the anti-reparation campaign. In the region, and the diaspora, there's a persistent argument against reparation. One put forward with the spirit of patriotism and the colonial mentality that one must bury their needs and desires. It is the belief that the reparatory justice movement is begging and belittles the advancement and achievement of the region. It does not deny, however, that colonial injustices are wrong or that an apology is not necessary. Instead, it speaks to pride in the advancements and achievements in the region in spite of colonialism and spotlights the missteps of the regional governments. This kind of argument isn't necessarily wrong, but it does overlook some facts. At the close of the colonial rule, a few things happened. At emancipation, formerly enslaved persons were not compensated for the centuries of harm they endured. In fact, their abusers were compensated for the loss in profit. Post-colonial Caribbean governments did not have access to the centuries of wealth earned by their ancestors' sacrifice. The infrastructure inherited adhered to the faulty colonial system and did not take into account the needs and experiences of the society and those who resided in these new nations. Of course, what has happened is that we have maintained a colonial education system, for example, that continues to create illiterate populations and propagating non-communicable diseases. Chronic illness, and of course, earlier I mentioned a bit about chronic diseases as well as mental health. These new nations were also tied to their colonizers by systemic economic, social, and cultural agreements made in their favor. This imbalance, this kind of imbalance of these immediate post-colonial years would lead to these new governments struggling to play catch up. How can one properly compete when the start line is 20 meters behind everyone else? If we were to use this track analogy. Caribbean governments have indeed created something out of nothing, but they could have achieved so much more if their capital was not stolen, their technology, culture, and artifacts not appropriated, and their people not taught that their heritage was not less than their enslavers. Outside of the region, former colonial governments build on this narrative of begging to demonize claims for reparatory justice. Politicians have vilified the region as wastrels, thieves, and beggars intent on exploiting European wealth and wasting it. I have to go no further than Kemi Badenoch's own, let me say, insensitive statements. Of course, she has gone so far as to call reparation a scam. This is, of course, the kind of atmosphere in which debates about reparation exist today. Britain continues to propagandize their role as abolitionists when the institution of chattel enslavement wouldn't have reached such lauded heights without them in their own terms. So what am I talking about in relation to this politics of responsibility? Acceptance of responsibility for the crimes against humanity executed in the Caribbean region is what is sought by the Caribbean reparation movement. If we look back, colonization began as a grab for power. All the arguments to support this global institution were made by European governments. Adam Smith stated that distinctly, colonization of the West Indies and the Americas did not follow the standard practice of colonies, which is based on need. It was about exerting power. Colonizers found their wealth here by happenstance and kept it all. In Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams also highlighted Smith's position that pride and love of power is the master led to slavery. This knowledge is, of course, compounded by the fact that former colonial governments reveal themselves within their own records. In Britain alone, there are several government debates which reveal the conscious effort to ignore imperial responsibility for harm done to the people of the Caribbean and Africa through the period of chattel enslavement and colonization. The foundation of this power addiction in Europe, which institutionalized colonialism and racism, gives power to the psychological space of the "it wasn't me" syndrome, the flip side of the same delusion Hickling highlighted. This syndrome allows descendants of the regime to throw off the mantle of responsibility, even as its legacies allows them to reign supreme on the world stage. Former colonizers then must remain ensconced and displaced from their historical connections to colonialism, enslavement, and systemic torture of whole races. For to understand and accept responsibility for reparation is to relinquish power, not only over their current and former colonies, but over their own nations. But it doesn't have to be that way. For those who are accepting responsibility in the form of reparation, there is still much to be desired. And I would want to say all is not lost. There is a way forward, and there have been reparation wins. And I want to show you my last slide in respect of this. The fact is, those who are afraid of reparation would not see the difficulty in not accepting responsibility. But who is afraid of reparation? And I would want to say those persons, we want to eliminate them. We want to eliminate those persons and that kind of thinking. A question now reverberating in my mind, this question of who is afraid of reparation. And some of that is also internal. This is a part of the repair. Reparation is not a cash handout, but a right in order that Africa and its diaspora might reclaim dignity following the diabolical duo of colonialism, racial injustice, and racial injustice. Human trafficking fueled the rise of Western empires basking in sugar, cotton, tobacco, gold, diamonds, and other resources, literally and figuratively. It is not divisive. Reparation is not divisive or a disruption to our sensibilities, but rather a reckoning, a call to atone, be accountable, and change paths. Reparation is not about the past. Rather, it is about present-day neocolonialism that keeps Caribbean and African territories in exploitative, capitalist, extractive trade deals with multinationals and financial institutions at the helm based on centuries of plunder. The past is therefore not easily forgotten when the present is its enduring mirror. It is not a bid for handouts. Rather, it is a moral right to restitution. Reparation is not an illusion, but rather a vision of the rational future based on centuries of debt owed to victims of chattel slavery and genocidal intent. Mainstreaming reparation is a must. There is work to be done internally as well, and I hasten to repeat that. Some victims do not understand reparation. And I want to highlight that in 2018, Scotland, through the University of Glasgow, pledged to assist the UWI to raise 20 million for reparatory justice initiatives. The University of Glasgow has also partnered with the UWI to establish the MA in reparatory justice. In 2019, the UK Jesus College repatriation of Benin bronzes to Nigeria and established a legacy of slavery working party. It went to ecclesiastical court to argue that enslaver Tobias Rustott should be taken down from inside the college's chapel. And this was, although unsuccessful, a means to repair. 2019, the USA Georgetown University committed $20 per student in tuition. This contribution has developed into an annual $400,000 contribution to communities beginning in 2022. Also, Princeton Theological Seminary, Virginia Theological Seminary, Lloyd's of London in the UK, a 52 million action with a formal apology, which has since followed up with a 52 million endowment in 2023. Green King Brewery in the UK, 2020. They have started initiatives in St. Kitts. Brown University in the UK, Cambridge University in the UK, published a report on the university's connection to slavery. Number of universities taking action and a number of institutions. I must also mention the Guardian newspaper to be pledging 10 million pounds. And this is now something ongoing. There is work to be done. In the UK as well, the Gladstone family initiatives in Guyana pledging 100,000 pounds. I want to just say, though, that part of the politics of responsibility is about those who have been implicated in the business of chattel enslavement and the exploitation of these nations being asked to allow these nations and peoples to determine how these funds in terms of reparation must also be used. And I have to look no further than to think about climate justice and educational reform as two pressing issues that nations that have been implicated in chattel enslavement would have as priorities. The Caribbean territories, for example, are in triple jeopardy by virtue of climate justice, climate change, and the challenges, the vulnerabilities around environmental degradation. And so I want to highlight that indeed the reparatory justice movement has wins and we can identify action being taken, but there is so much more to go. The actions by the CARICOM Reparation Commission on behalf of the Caribbean region in pursuit of reparatory justice have in fact yielded significant results. The creation of the 10-point plan has forced persons to contend with the legacies of colonialism and enslavement that persist in our societies today. To cope with this reality, they have developed faulty arguments to deflect and distance themselves, and we have to move away from this kind of dismissal. Revealing the faults in arguments that call reparation begging or classify it as a scam or a money grab, and highlighting the need for responsibility by descendants of enslavers who continue to profit either financially, socially, or politically from their ill-gotten gains needs to be our priority. And to do so, we must continue to advocate and educate our communities and the world through the infrastructure established by the reparation advocates who have made these successes possible. I want to highlight also that climate reparations, as a matter of fact, climate justice is reparatory justice. Educational reform that is made a priority is reparation. And so in the context of this presentation, my own emphasis on climate justice, climate reparation, and in fact, educational reform are two of the things I want to leave in your thoughts as I close and say thank you to all of you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonjah. That was fantastic, and thanks for leaving us with an emphasis on those two, educational reform and climate justice. I just want to remind everyone watching that you can type questions in the chat or just raise your hand and we can spotlight you to ask Sonjah questions. While people are gathering their thoughts, I wondered if I could ask about, you mentioned at the end educational reform, you also mentioned psychohistoriography, and I think, and the Glasgow agreement, and I think I read somewhere that you teach a course on the joint MA with Glasgow on psychohistoriography. And in the same interview, I saw you saying that at the time last year, there were no undergraduate courses in the Caribbean on reparations. And I was wondering if I could ask you a two-part question, if that's still the case, and also if you could tell us a bit about what you do in your psychohistoriography module as part of the master's.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. I do teach a course on psychohistoriography and reparatory justice in the University of Glasgow, UWI Masters in Reparatory Justice program. I developed the course because I thought, considering the state of the region, NCDs, mental health challenges, the focus of the course is really on health as well. So that taking a look back and understanding repair as a futuristic, sort of present and futuristic endeavor, that students in that program would need to have a handle on what repair really means when we talk about the whole human experience. And I did say in the beginning of my presentation that when I talk about repair, I am in fact talking about repair in a holistic sense. So yes, the truth is that there are no undergraduate courses on reparatory justice. There are smatterings, obviously, in terms of history courses and so on, where students might engage with the question of reparatory justice or questions about repair, learning about the history in terms of movement, chattel slavery, and so on, transshipment, and so on. But I am very clear that in as much as I acknowledge at the beginning of this presentation that this can be triggering, the reason why the Masters in Reparatory Justice is at that level is precisely because we want students to engage with this at the graduate level as in a sense, as mature thinkers. Now, we want to absolutely routinize and mainstream reparatory justice and reparatory justice thinking and reparatory justice scholarship. But just in the way that cultural studies, my own home discipline, is at the graduate level and has remained principally at the graduate level in a global sense, I think reparatory justice, for obvious reasons, might be one of the things that a student would come to it or would need to come to it with a sort of grounding in another kind of discipline. But I also want to highlight that the Center for Reparation Research, where I'm located, went about engaging with the academic community across the University of the West Indies, and will soon do that in a larger context to find out, well, you're doing work in history, you're doing work in mathematics, you're doing work in psychiatry. Does it have implications for reparatory justice? Because if we understand reparatory justice to be holistic, we must see the interdisciplinarity, the multidisciplinarity, and the implications for some of the very disciplines that we've boxed ourselves into that we don't see as implicating or implicated in reparatory justice conversations. So we launched a reparatory justice research cluster at the UWI in February, and are moving to make sure that no academic interested in repair, in questions of repair, in questions of reparatory justice, will be left out of the task of doing research or being enabled to do research, and to have that research disseminated in a regional and global context. I hope I've answered your questions.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. The first question, we've got someone raising their hand, is Keith Jago. I will just, he's been popped up as a panelist briefly. So Keith, if you want to unmute yourself so you can ask Sonjah. I'm not sure if we can hear you, Keith. No? Okay. Maybe if we just take a second to see if Keith can figure that out. There is another question in the chat from Reinhard Huss, which is, how do you consider the genocide of the native inhabitants in the Caribbean and the destruction of African communities through enslavement in your reparatory justice approach?
Yes. Thank you so much for that question, Reinhard. I would want to just quickly say that when we talk about reparatory justice in the Caribbean, we are absolutely including the indigenous peoples, the native inhabitants of the Caribbean. In Jamaica, where I reside, we're talking there about the Tainos. In other countries, Belize and so on, the Kalinagos. Yes, so these are included, obviously. There was, in fact, certainly under Spanish and British rule, quite a bit of activity that would be considered genocidal in terms of the native inhabitants. So yes, we have, in fact, the University of the West Indies has announced its intention to establish an institute, a Maroons Institute, Indigenous and African, in order to take care of some of this in terms of a repair movement.
Should we try see if Keith's mic is working again? Keith, do you want to ask your question? Just want to check it's not me. Can you hear Keith, Sonjah?
I can't.
No.
Did
Okay.
he type a question in the chat?
He hasn't typed one.
Okay.
If you could, Keith, that would be great, and we can, in case we can't get sound from you. There is a point and a question from our colleague Alan Lester in the chat. I can read it out unless you want to, Alan. If you pop your hand up, I'm sure.
I'm reading the comment here. One minor point, something about the slaving ship, the image I showed highlighting the horrors, but it is of the ship Brooks set up to abide by new regulations of the 1780s, limiting the number of captives. Yes, in reality, most ships packed in far more captives than the regulations permitted. This could usefully be pointed out when objectors try to minimize the scale of the atrocity. Thank you for your comment there, Alan.
So Alan is here if he can speak his question. I think he's up on the panel now. Alan?
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thanks ever so much. Sorry to sort of sound like a bit of a know-it-all about that point about the ship. I only just read this article quite recently, and I've seen that diagram used again and again to illustrate the horrors of the Middle Passage. And it came as a surprise to me that is, if you like, as the people have thought of it, the ideal slave ship that actually conformed to new regulations, stating from the British government how they would ameliorate conditions by limiting the number of bodies per square foot. And in practice, most ships' captains ignored that. Most human traffickers squeezed in far more people. So conditions are actually far worse. So I've put up a link for those who want to read about that. But I think that the main thing I wanted to ask you, and thanks, by the way, for a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed that, really learned a lot from you. Thank you. Was about the objections that one hears again and again. You mentioned the ways in which people evade accountability, evade responsibility. The "it wasn't us" thing. One of the things that you hear most often is deflection to the whole history of slavery, in human history, and the idea that there was nothing special, nothing particularly atrocious about the transatlantic slave trade and plantation system. And one of the usual deflections is to Arab slavery, which involves everything from sort of Barbary corsairs, who captured white people and enslaved them. So a lot of people say, well, white people were enslaved too. We're not asking for reparations. But most often it's about the trans-Saharan and Red Sea slave trade. Now, of course, there are huge differences between those systems of slavery. The Arab system didn't create a modern capitalist global inequality and racialized inequality in the way that the transatlantic system did. But I'm starting to think more and more that when we teach about transatlantic slavery, we need to make this explicit, that this was an entirely new phenomenon in the history of slavery, nothing like any prior slave system, and that its continuities are far more linear between past and present, that there is a direct thread of continuity to racial inequities today. So I think, I wonder what you think about the idea that when we teach this, we have to contextualize it rather than treat it as a discrete phenomenon.
Absolutely, Alan. So you've asked the question, but you've answered your question, and I take your answer that we must indeed distinguish it more explicitly from prior non-capitalized forms. It was distinctly different. And so it also is the argument about the large numbers, the sheer numbers. 12 million transported in that capitalist, extractivist system of enslavement. It's the scale and proportion, the distinct features, chattel enslavement, distinguishable from indentureship, even though those persons, the Asian indentured laborers, were in fact tricked as well. But yes, you are correct, and I do endorse the teaching of this by virtue of this distinguishing feature.
Thank you.
Thanks both. There's some more questioners with hands up, but I just Keith Jogo's questions have been written out, so I wanted to pose them to you, Sonjah. The first one, I'm not sure I entirely catch. Keith, you said OHPs, please. If you could type in the chat what you mean, that would be great. And then the second one from Keith Jogo is, reparations are essentially quantified in financial terms. In UK law, damages are given in pounds. These issues are profoundly complex, but how do you quantify in pound terms, and what kind of figures are emerging?
So I'm not sure, Keith, if you are familiar with the Bratler report. So the Bratler report, the one I mentioned on the quantification for transatlantic trade in Africans across the Americas, we're up to about 9 trillion rather. And this is on the basis of some very systematic calculations leading into present day context. So I'm not an economist. I'm not a part of that group. And while I've read the report, it is not the sole substance of the reparatory justice claim. So once you understand that there is a context for an apology, first there is an acceptance of responsibility, we ought to understand what would naturally follow from there. And I've shared some of the successes of the movement so far in terms of ways in which entities, institutions, families have tried to engage in conversations and actions about repair. So we are clear that the quantification is one component, but that we must have a diverse context for engaging in this reparatory justice. I hope that responds to you.
Thanks very much, Sonjah. And Keith has clarified, I think he was asking for if it will be possible to share your slides. If I don't know if there's a way that we can share that with speakers, if you're okay with doing that. I can talk to you and Gary afterwards.
Sure.
But just on the Brattle report, I popped that into the chat so you can see, Keith and others, that there's very detailed calculations estimating loss of life, uncompensated labor damages, using all kinds of interest rates and assumptions, and showing that any way you slice it, the number is huge. But yeah, as you said, that's not the whole picture. There are a couple more questions in the chat, but I think Alice Corbell had her hand up to speak in person before those. There we go. Here's Alice.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Stanley Niaah, for a really excellent lecture. I just wanted to return to your point about interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary knowledge and collaborations in this work, and how important that is for the holistic approach. And I wondered if in this new reparatory research cluster at UWI, if that includes or plans to include the work of librarians and archivists in the university, not only in terms of the work that they do to give access to knowledge on these topics, but also in the sort of infrastructural knowledge that they have on this. And if I could just say, connected to that, then what do you think is the role of academic institutions and librarians, etc., in the UK in terms of the kind of epistemic justice and access issues that can come up in this kind of work? I hope that makes sense, but I'm just wanting to hear your thoughts about the role of librarians and archivists in this work.
Thank you so much, Alice. Of course. Well, let me just give you a bit of a background. We sent a survey out to the entire university community. That's 5 campuses across the region. And we got 30 responses across 6 or so faculties. So pretty much representing many of the core, let's say, aggregations of disciplines within a university. And there is indeed representation from Department of Library and Information Studies. But even beyond that, we know that a lot of what has been lost, epistemic genocide, is real. And a lot of the information, the sources, the knowledge about the region is held in archives outside of the region. And so we are very clear that in an interdisciplinary context, reparatory justice also means being able to liaise and find partnerships, meaningful partnerships with institutions, in particular within the colonizing nations that have large holdings. And we, of course, have been having these conversations. We have been having these conversations with the University of Glasgow. We are about to engage in conversations with a number of other universities in relation to the return and, creation of access points for people in the region in relation to these archives. Kew Gardens, it gets implicated all the time. We have lost a lot of knowledge in the region. People have to go to these archives in order to really do research, whether it is on the cultural, spiritual, environmental, biology. It's far and wide. So thank you so much for pointing that out and for allowing me to expand on that.
Thanks, Alice and Sonjah. There's a few more questions in the chat. Andrea Papan has asked, following up on the earlier question on Indigenous peoples, how do you consider those who were Indian indentured laborers, such as in Trinidad and Tobago, in reparations?
Well, I'm happy to tell you that Trinidad and Tobago definitely is represented in the movement. It's a CARICOM initiative. And so we are very clear that the reparation movement is also about those who would have been scammed in an indentureship movement. And so as the movement matures, all of those things will emerge. I can tell you, for example, that in Mauritius, there is already a museum established to highlight the atrocities around indentureship. So that knowledge is not lost to us.
Thank you. And another one from the chat, Eve McCown, says, hi, Sonjah, thank you so much for speaking to us today and all the work you're doing on this. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on whether we should start to expand understanding of reparatory justice, mainly in 2 areas. 1, how can Caribbean diaspora in US, UK, Canada, elsewhere be also incorporated into reparatory justice solutions? And 2, how can we start to quantify exploitation in the post-emancipation period, where Caribbean countries do face structural challenges in international trade and politics? Or should we expand our understanding of reparatory justice? Maybe doing so dismisses the specific violence of slavery as a sort of afterthought in brackets.
Right. So I'll start with the second one. Certainly, where the United States is concerned, is that the first one or the second one? I can't remember now. right, where the United States is concerned, we have strong ties with the reparatory justice movement. And if you were here at the beginning of the talk, you'd have heard me use the example of the United States, with California as the very first state establishing a commission to quantify and suggest ways to repair the damage from a history of oppression for Blacks in that country. So, and there's a strong movement. In fact, you can see their website. I think it was posted in the chat by someone as well. The ways in which the United States, through the National African American Reparations Commission, is advancing their own movement, inspired by the CARICOM reparations movement. So we have to evolve in terms of a working relationship that, you know, solidifies these ties. And we are doing that. In fact, next week, Tuesday, we have a commemoration with Ron Daniels and team in relation to the National African American Reparations Commission and the work they're doing. So there's quite a bit of work being done to solidify these associations. And the second question again was around the empowerment.
So it was, how can we start to quantify exploitation in the post-emancipation period, where Caribbean countries do face structural challenges in international trade and politics? But the sort of counter to that was asked, is it maybe risky expanding reparatory justice to include post-emancipation, in that it might dismiss the specific violence of
Right. The quantification, sorry, yes. So the Bratler report, which was posted in the chat, does the premise on which that calculation was made was also about the post-colonial impact of chattel enslavement, and the transatlantic trade in general within the Americas. And so we are definitely incorporating an understanding of the enduring legacies of the transatlantic trade, chattel enslavement, genocidal activities in relation to indigenous or native inhabitants and Africans in general who were brought to this part of the world. This is very much inside of the understanding of repair.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat, but I wondered if I could just jump on that, because that was a question about, potentially expanding understandings of reparatory justice. And you had mentioned at the end of your talk about climate justice is reparatory justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you could expand a bit on that. How do you see those as being coterminous? Are they related to histories of chattel slavery, or is it something else that you're drawing together in these calls for reparation?
Absolutely related to, and this is something that many persons don't understand. So thank you for bringing that up for me to expand on. Where climate justice is concerned, we're talking about people who are transported to this part of the world, the Caribbean, a region vulnerable in terms of hurricanes, droughts. We didn't ask to be transported to this part of the world. And so the Caribbean has fallen victim to an increasing number of natural disasters in this time as well. Small island developing states, vulnerable at least very much to hurricanes. I'm talking about figures that look like 10 major hurricanes in the 1990s, increasing to 25 in the 2000s, 26 in the 2010s, and closing in on 20 in this new decade already. So there is this steady increase in frequency and magnitude of destructive activities, destructive natural occurrences such as hurricanes. That's not the only thing. We have droughts and spiraling heat waves. This is something that immediately impacts food security. So the devastating depressions, storms, hurricanes, the issue of food security then becomes important. I lived through major Hurricane Beryl, which devastated the food basket area in Jamaica. We still have not recovered in terms of the banana and planting crops. Planting is something I dearly love. I've been without access to this food for some time. These are, the kinds of realities that we're talking about. And so these conditions are no longer stable. They certainly weren't stable before, but they're certainly not stable now. And we're talking about increased potential of soil erosion, therefore crop yields, and so on. So reparation does relate to climate change, does relate to climate justice. And of course, we're talking now about a 20th century, 21st century phenomenon and conversation, but it dates back to the Europeans first arriving in the Caribbean during the 15th century, introducing, things like a sort of intention for monocropping, the kind of agricultural methods that were introduced, the plantation system. Those did not add in any way to a kind of holistic philosophy, the traditional ways of using the land. In fact, quite the opposite. These ways certainly devastated the kinds of traditional uses of land. So yes, while the CARICOM 10-point plan in its original formulation from 2013 does not immediately identify climate justice or climate change in its articulation, it's now being revised. And we want to definitely highlight the fact that climate change and climate justice is in fact very much tied to, these are tied to reparatory justice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for expanding on that. And sorry for queue jumping the questions. The next one in the chat is from Gautier Moshe, who writes, "Thanks for an excellent and very inspiring presentation. In the UK, slave owners were fully compensated for the financial loss that the abolition imparted to them on the basis of the principle of private property, and the compensation was paid through public debt, thus paid by British taxpayers with significant interest. Do you think that the imperative and essential discussion about reparations should take into account this factor, and how? This is really a question about who profited from chattel slavery and whom should be financially responsible for reparations."
So it sounds again that this question was answered. And just to say that, yes, we are clear that those who owned plantations were compensated, but those who were laborers on those plantations, who were transported forcibly from their homes, loss of kinship, loss of family connections, loss of, right to religion, right to land, right to everything, right to life, really, right to their own bodies. They were not compensated. And so we hold these truths as fundamental in the considerations about reparatory justice, and that the claim for reparation is therefore not unfounded, and that those who profited and were compensated from slavery and the plantation economy must in fact be held accountable and be the first on call for reparatory justice. And I'm happy to tell you that some of these persons have responded. Families have responded in the reparatory justice movement. But at the state level, we're not going to do as the cannabis industry in the United States, as an example, has evolved. The federal government in the United States refuses to make any change in relation to legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis. But at the state level, we are seeing numerous states making waves in terms of their own and building their own cannabis industries. That's not the route we're going to take with reparatory justice and reparation for transatlantic slavery. The states must also take responsibility.
Thank you, Sonjah. So another question in the chat from Heather Williams. Thank you, Sonjah. Could you expand on the ways that psychohistoriography can be used as a tool of resistance and healing in the struggle for reparatory justice, especially in post-colonial societies?
Thank you for that question. You know, it was Sylvia Wynter whose work brought me to a greater understanding of what Freddie Hickling tried to do in his work on psychohistoriography. And as a graduate student, as a PhD student, I didn't know, I couldn't see into the future, but, you know, had a slight inkling about the fact that this was all going to make sense at some point. But Sylvia Wynter was clear that the Pope must have been mad and the King of Castile drunk. It might have been, I might be transposing those descriptions, but it is the very same occupation that Freddie Hickling in his psychiatry engaged with to come up with this context of psychohistoriography. And so I find it very important to shift the philosophy, shift the mental focus through Freddie Hickling's work in an understanding of the delusion that Europe would have been engaged with. And I think if victims and their ancestors, or us as descendants of the victims of enslavement, understand this kind of delusion, we would not be trying to engage in a Black supremacist thought pattern or philosophy, but to help to shift the kind of disempowerment, the disenfranchisement, and the thought patterns that have left us crippled in a sense in relation to this kind of existence today in a post-colonial reality. So yes, I think that the healing in the struggle for reparatory justice must be premised on in fact, we must call on all the weapons. We must call on all the mental and intellectual weapons. And I think psychohistoriography is obviously one of them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Just want to check I haven't missed anyone.
This is fantastic. I see all the links being shared in the chat for those who want to engage with them. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you for referencing so many interesting things that are I'm sure people will be excited to follow up.
I did say I was taking you all on an intellectual journey that I've been on.
If I've missed anyone in the chat or further up, can you stick your hand up now? Or if there is just anyone else who has a further question not yet addressed? Okay. There is another question from Heather Williams on how worried should we be about Trump's delusionary direction, I guess.
I think that's out of the remit of my presentation. However, let me acknowledge that there is great anxiety, and I think there is justification for this kind of anxiety. We're seeing the reversal of some of the things we've thought to be progressive. Change is uncomfortable. Worse, not just change, but what we see to be, or what we deem to be, unprogressive change can be devastating. And I know many of us are very uncomfortable. Some people are losing their jobs. Their relatives are losing their jobs. This is affecting all of us. And I echo the words of Mia Mottley, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, who recently, in her message to CARICOM, confronted this question head on, that we do not, and have never lived in a world isolated from others. The United States is the Caribbean's closest neighbor. We live in the Americas, and the Americas will continue to evolve, I think, as a region in the world where we have to coexist. So we continue to advocate. We continue to converse. We continue to engage in debate and to hope that reason will prevail and that some good will come out of it. And I've been telling my friends and my colleagues that I know that something very positive is going to happen. I just don't know how, and I don't know what.
Thank you. And that Alice has put in the chat a forum from your Vice Chancellor at UWI
Definitely.
on the Trump policy shift.
Yes.
Sure, as with many other initiatives that involve multilateral forums, the push for reparations is going to be in some way touched or shaped, or something's going to happen in response to what Trump is doing to other multilateral institutions. But yes, we shall have to see.
I think new cleavages will also form.
Yes, well, I think yes.
That's the important thing. That perhaps, and I'll say it here, apologies might come so swiftly now from former colonizing nations that have to cleave to other parts of the world because of these new formations, these new geopolitical formations. And I welcome those conversations.
Yes, we have one other hand, sorry, that's just been raised, Andrea Papan, if we could thank you.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh, hi, Sonjah. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. I wanted to ask you because actually, I myself, my family is originally from Trinidad, and so I'm just asking you because, you know, you're from Jamaica, and Jamaica is a very powerful, or well, you're based in Jamaica. I don't know if you're originally from Jamaica, but I guess the thing is both. So Jamaica to me seems like the center, the kind of, you know, the knowledge base, the hub, there is such a powerful force in Jamaica, and a lot of this discussion makes me wonder the regional, because you mentioned CARICOM a number of times, and so I'm just wondering, how is this spreading across the region, like in the balance of how this, because I mean, of course, Barbados, we've seen a really great stance from Barbados, but the movements you're talking about, how is that working, and how do you see that working with the smaller islands, and how does that momentum reach and work, and how do you see that working for the other islands in other ways so that it will actually come to fruition? Because for it to be happening in Jamaica is one thing, and for it to be happening in graduate studies courses at UE, and to be educated, you know, for graduate students to come to that mature understanding that you were talking about, that is one thing. But the other types of connections and that growth of kind of, I don't know if I mean grassroots or something else. How is that going to take place, I guess, is what I'm wondering about. Because what you're talking about is extremely important, and it seems like it's going to be a long process, and in such an important one. I was just curious.
I want to use thank you for your question, Andrea. I want to use the example of Marcus Garvey's UNIA. And at the time when Marcus Garvey was advocating, had caught the wind that Trinidadians like Henry Sylvester Williams Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and all of these people. There was a foment, but it didn't start as a foment. It started as one person, two persons, three persons until it became a movement. The CARICOM reparations movement is young. Marcus Garvey's UNIA, and still with all of what he did, reaching countries and people who today can still tell you that they are Garveyites in a time when there was no internet, a phenomenal movement. The CARICOM reparations movement is young compared to Marcus Garvey's UNIA. And we can think of the Black Power movement and all of those, that the Black Lives Matter movement, the ways in which it just takes one incident, one moment to crystallize action, reaction, a solid movement around something. So I have hope that with Jamaica's voice, with the voice of Barbadians, with the voice of Trinidadians, especially in this time when we can see the effect of, non-progressive moves, it's important that we stay abreast of what's going on and that we educate ourselves. I've been talking to people in the Caribbean about having the conversations in their own bedrooms, the conversations in their own homes, on their verandas, so that we mainstream reparatory justice. This is why I accept the invitation to do talks like these. It's not because as an academic, I need to be talking about reparatory justice, but I've said to my husband, I've said to my close friends, this is the only job we have right now. Reparatory justice is the justice we need as peoples of African descent. And I would want to suggest also that not just for peoples of African descent, it is for the human race. It is for the entire human race. And I would want to say to you, I empathize and I understand your concern, because yes, Jamaica, ironically, seen as a voice, a liberatory voice in the world where matters of African, African pride and African liberation are concerned. But even Jamaica is behind in the reparatory justice movement. While there's an ecosystem in the region, which includes the national reparation committees established in each territory, each CARICOM territory, some committees are more active than others. Some committees are there meeting every month and they're not doing anything, they're not achieving anything. So there's much work to be done in each country. I hope I've at least addressed some of your concerns.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, and I'll tell you that this Center for Reparation Research, in trying to address the very question you've asked, we have launched an international reparation debate. We had 24 schools across the Caribbean. And what's interesting is that across the Caribbean and one from the UK, what's interesting is that the students were the ones, based on our marketing objectives, they took the knowledge about the competition to the teachers. So listen, I think the adults, they're on their way, they're lost. We are now interested in the youth. So the debating competition, that's the kind of strategy. And there are all kinds of, ways in which the young people are excited. Yes, the prize is important, but for me, it's going to be the lasting effect. It's going to be the conversations they're having in their homes when they're preparing for these debates. It's going to be what they remember in 2 and 3 and 5 years' time about how they participated in this competition and what it means to them personally as humans, as Africans living in the diaspora.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I could just ask one more sort of clarificatory question before we might have to wrap up. You've talked a lot about the importance of sort of talking about reparations and reparatory justice, saying it's the job you have right now to encourage these conversations. And obviously you have the school debates. But you also mentioned earlier about the sort of need for reparatory justice to be something that happens at master's level in the Glasgow course. So are you thinking about sort of different ways of approaching this, or different forms of knowledge about this? Sort of what are the limits or the possibilities of the knowledge that you want everyone talking about, as opposed to what you said works better at a postgraduate level?
So let me begin by saying that any program, any educational program would need to be supported by materials that students can access.
Right.
And so one of the things we are short on, let's say compared to disciplines like sociology or anthropology or, you know, mathematics, is scholarship, research. And so we would need, and this is why when I entered the Center for Reparation Research, we sent out a survey and launched a reparatory justice cluster, because it is our intention to encourage research, encourage publications, encourage the distribution of materials that would support whether the graduate level, the undergraduate level, or the secondary school level. And so we have in the center been making materials available for secondary school students, supporting the history curriculum in the Caribbean. And this is why we could have launched the International Reparation Debate Competition, because we know that the students in the history courses are in high schools are actually, you know, they engage with reparation in the history course. So it's a multifaceted intervention. And so I'm not limiting my own, thoughts or conceptions around this at the graduate level. I'm very clear that we are taking steps to build an archive, to build a corpus of materials that will be available to students at all levels, to individuals, and that we must also mainstream reparation to reach, and you would have heard in my presentation, that at no point am I leaving the cultural workers out of this. That it's in exhibitions, it's in you know, the creative writings, it's in the music. And so everyone is implicated in reparatory justice education.
Well, that's a brilliant note to end on. I think we're sort of 2 minutes from our time being up. So thank you so much, Professor Sonjah Stanley Niaah, and all the wonderful attendees for your questions and keeping the discussion going right until the end. Appreciate you joining us all the way from Tallahassee. And yeah, looking forward to see what comes out of the center in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone who has been here sharing. Thank you, Alice. You've been wonderful. All the links you've posted. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you to the entire team. We've waited for a few, maybe it's been a couple of months. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I should say, just as we close, the recording of this will be available on the IDS website, and it will be emailed to all attendees and also the people who registered but didn't attend. And this was the final one of the 2024-25 series. There'll be more Sussex Development Lectures in autumn, and you'll be able to watch this video and the others from this series via the link that I've just popped in the chat there. So thank you, Sonjah, and thank you everyone else again.